Given we are now in a post-Baldur's Gate 3 world, the big question is, are we going to start seeing many more RPGs, CRPGs like Baldur's Gate 3, or was it an anomaly? Is there going to be no more like it and we're just going to go back to the status quo? Action-based RPGs, all for the mainstream, none of that old school influence. And I've been thinking about that today because there has been a Twitter exchange between RPG veterans Josh Sawyer, who was the director of New Vegas. He's at Obsidian. He was responsible for Pillars of Eternity, many other titles as well. Also David Gator, who was at old school BioWare back in the Baldur's Gate days. Many of their old school ones, Anthem world, when they still had a bit of integrity. But I think this is interesting because they've been talking about the death of CRPGs, which was kind of back in the early 2000s. Is history going to repeat? Are we going to see a handful of CRPGs and then the genre is going to be back on ice? We're not going to see any for a while? Or can we finally start seeing CRPGs as the norm for this genre instead of action-focused games like maybe a Skyrim being what people associate with generally RPGs, and CRPGs, isometric, controlling a party, being seen as the niche variant, I suppose. So we're going to go through this exchange of how CRPGs died, what these industry veterans think, and then we can talk about what it all means. So this basically starts with a former Obsidian developer talking about how game sales used to be super reliant on retail stores, like a Walmart in America. And this was long before the days of Steam, where you could just bypass all this, digitally download your favorite game. You would only really know about a new release, a great new RPG, if you walked into that store and you saw it at eye level. It had the cool orc or warrior on the shelf with the big sword and shield, and you were sold. You bought the game because it looked cool and not much else. He goes on to say, we can complain about digital distribution all we want, but retail was its own special nightmare. Now, I'm not sure what his grievances with digital distribution would be. Steam's not perfect. I mean, it's my preferred platform, maybe GOG as well, but I'll never touch Epic. I don't care how many free games they give me, I'm not going near it. But I will say that 30% cut, if that's what he's kind of talking about there, I've never really understood that, because isn't that what Microsoft and Sony, I assume Nintendo as well, charge anyway? It is an industry standard, no matter what Tim Sweeney says. I think that's just kind of the done thing, and at least Steam is good for consumers, unlike Epic that just seems to be good for no one. No one's on the platform buying these sorts of games, so who cares if you get a better cut? But his main point is that the retail industry was hard to deal with. Makes sense, again, back then they had all the hands. You only sold games if they put your game on store shelves and gave you a good spot in the store. And Josh Sawyer, renowned RPG director, game developer, Fallout New Vegas, many others, he goes on to say, it was extra special how Walmart would act incredibly prudish about certain types of content, but would throw all of that right out of the window for GTA. Basically saying that they'd go on about integrity and, oh, we've got a certain standard here at Walmart or insert generic retail store. However, if it's GTA, if we know the money's coming in, then forget all of that. No, just put it on the shelf. Don't even bother checking IDs because we're going to make a ton of cash. And the other developer continues, I think the worst thing was the self-fulfilling vibes about a certain genre or mechanic or whatever not selling well. So the retailers wouldn't stock games with it, and thus they wouldn't sell at all. And basically what he's referring to is if you were making a game and it was perceived to be uncool by these decision makers at the retail stores, the people making the big bucks calling the shots, then your game's simply not going to get put on the shelf, therefore it's not going to sell. And he mentions that self-fulfilling prophecy because if your game sells well and it only sold badly because no one would stock it, you make a new game in the same genre, you try and sell that, and they say, well, your last game didn't sell well, so why would we stock this? It does obviously feel a bit stupid, but I think those sorts of executives, they know what they're doing. The problem in gaming, especially back then, is sure you had games like Baldur's Gate 2 and the Fallouts that did sell well, and Josh Sawyer talks about, we'll look at that in a second. However, they didn't make all of the money, not like some of the live service juggernauts, the Destinies we have now, all the mobile games, the Candy Crushers and so on. They weren't bringing in the real dollars. And for that reason, I do think these executives were thinking, we only really want games like GTA. We don't care if you produce some RPG and it sells 1 million, 2 million copies. We only care about making the next San Andreas the next big thing. And basically, these big retail guys were simply turning them away, not because of evidence their games would flop, but because their games just weren't going to be juggernauts. And we were around that time just before, say, the original Xbox launch, the PS2 massively successful, and that's probably what the retail stores were focused on. Unfortunately, not nerdy role-playing games. And this guy ends here saying, the early 2000s was so brutal for this one reason, why that era was so homogenous in my opinion. And this does continue because someone asks Josh Sawyer, what do you mean when he was talking about the issues with Walmart and not stocking their games? And he clarifies saying, BioWare made Baldur's Gate, which sold well. Baldur's Gate 2 sold very well. It was even bigger, one of the bigger RPGs at the time. Still very good. If you like Baldur's Gate 3 and haven't played that, it really holds up. It's a fantastic RPG. Black Isle made Icewind Dale. That's sort of like a more combat-focused Baldur's Gate. It's got less of a story focus, but if you like the Dungeons & Dragons combat system, there is a lot to like in that one and the sequel as well. That game sold too, but after BioWare announced Neverwinter Nights, retailers decided that 2D ISO games were dead, and Neverwinter Nights, it's been a long time since I've seen it. I believe it's 3D, one of those early 3D games. What I do know of it is the game doesn't really play that well. It's definitely not as good as playing through the original Baldur's Gate, especially the second one. However, I have since learned that Neverwinter Nights was actually never really meant to be just a single-player video game that you go through. It was actually meant to be just 3D Dungeons & Dragons, so you could obviously create your own mods, your own campaigns, and it's kind of why the actual base game, if you play through the main story, it feels super generic. It makes so much sense that it was just meant to be 3D D&D, not really advertising itself as the big single-player game, but I don't think that really got across, or at least maybe when they were developing it towards the end, there was some sort of big push for them. No, you just need to release it as if it's the next Baldur's Gate, not just some 3D Dungeons & Dragons where you make your own fun with mods and such. He finishes with, retailers decided that 2D ISO games were dead. Temple of Elemental Evil was the last for a long time. And by that he means 2D isometric games. So again, your Baldur's Gates, your original Fallout titles, Planescape Torment. If you're not sure about those, maybe Age of Empires, the original ones, as a mainstream example, even though it's not an RPG. And Temple of Elemental Evil, that's made by the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines devs, Troika. So that would have been around sort of early, maybe 2003, 2004 or so, which makes sense. That's sort of when CRPGs died off originally, and there was basically nothing for a very long time. The closest that you had was BioWare releasing, say, Dragon Age Origins and also Mass Effect, but there was way more of a console focus then. Absolutely everything was pushed on, oh, it's got to be on Xbox, it's got to be on the PlayStation, it's got to have a controller focus, keyboard and mouse, what the hell is that? No game can be designed around keyboard and mouse. That was the mindset at the time. And I mentioned Steam earlier, Valve, and I will say this, I will always respect them because they focused on and prioritized PC gaming when it was considered uncool. While pretty much every other developer, publisher couldn't give a toss about PC gaming, they said, no, we can see it's being underutilized and we're going to bring it back. We're going to bring it back to the mainstream, which is exactly what they did. You know who did not do that and did not give a fuck about PC gaming? Epic Games. They chased the console money with Gears of War. They left PC behind, and then suddenly went, oh, PC gaming's a big thing again, there's money there. Suddenly they come crawling back. They obviously had Fortnite, but now they have their Epic Games store, and they act like they give a toss about PC gamers. It's still Tim Sweeney. He was always there. He was making those decisions back then. He turned his back on PC gamers, and now he's sucking up. He thinks he can lure lure you in with candy-free games. Don't give him a bar of it. That guy's a poser, he's a liar, and he's a fraud. I don't think he's going to be investing any of the money we give him back into the benefits of PC gaming and pushing the platform forward. He doesn't really care. He just chases the money wherever it goes, including from China, including from Tencent, let's be honest. But basically that was the era. All of these RPGs, even if we got them, they were console focused, and therefore they didn't really feel like CRPGs, which makes sense given that stands for computer role-playing game. And Josh continues, I can't stress enough how often I'd hear a retail rep declare a genre, style, look was dead with zero supporting data. And given I believe Josh has mainly just worked on RPGs, I'm guessing that's what he's talking about. He was pitching role-playing games, trying to get them on shelves, and those reps probably said, no, we don't want to have the Fallout 3 that you're making. I don't know if Josh was actually making that, but there was a genuine Fallout 3 in development at one point that was going to be isometric before Bethesda bought it and did their own thing, and now we've got Fallout 76 and everything else. It's a total shambles. And he continues with truly vibes-based forecasting, which results in self-fulfilling prophecies. And he's probably implying what I mentioned earlier, which is these retail guys just did not want to stock these games. They knew they were never going to be juggernauts, big sellers that were going to change the face of gaming, bring it into the mainstream, make investors a whole ton of money. They were just going to be maybe nice $1-2 million sellers, but they were never going to be games absolutely flying off the store shelves. And therefore, these people didn't give a shit. They don't care about games, they only care about making money. And then he puts in quotes here, see, the thing we refused to stock didn't sell. No one wants these games anymore. And I've seen this all the time in the modern day as well. Do you remember when EA were talking about how, oh, no one wants single-player games, everyone wants live service? Well, did you actually ask players of video games, or did you only ask investors? And they gave the answer that they thought would bring in the most money. That's pretty much what happened. Whenever these video game publishers talk about listening to customers, they really mean listening to investors. It's purely money-motivated decisions, and unfortunately, listening to the players does not always translate to more profits. That's what we have to remember. And I think this is all supremely relevant today, because I will tell you this. Baldur's Gate 3 being a success, it's great for gamers, it's great for us. We're hoping to get more. We want to see high standards. Get fucked with that mindset that we saw a few months ago when we had these lazy, entitled devs banging on about, oh no, Baldur's Gate 3 can't be the new standard. I might actually have to do some work. I might actually have to be creative. I'm a talentless hack. I'm not going to make it in this post-Baldur's Gate 3 world. No, it can't be the new standard. We have to go back to Mass Effect Andromeda days. The days when Bethesda tried to convince us that Fallout 4 was peak RPG. And you know what? These developers, these publishers, they pine for a day where gamers think that Starfield, that is gaming at its best. It doesn't get any better than that. Unfortunately, they were thwarted by companies like Larian who have shown us there is much better. I mean, even these older 2000s games that Josh has referred to, like Baldur's Gate 2, they are way ahead of something like Starfield, but they always try and convince us, no, that's outdated because the graphics aren't shiny. Who cares about the gameplay depth of these old 90s and 2000s gameplay? Who cares? It's all about set pieces and visual. No one cares about actually using your brain and actually having fun through the content. That doesn't matter. It's all about what you see on the screen. No thinking, nothing else. That's the world that they try and convince us that we're in. We then get the CEO from Beamdog. That's the studio that's made like the Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 special editions and a whole bunch of other ones. I don't really care about this studio. All they do is seemingly make money of old games that they had no hand in making. When they make original content, it seems to be purely rubbish. They even put agendas, political messaging in these old games that didn't have them. As far as I see it, they're a pathetic studio who haven't really done anything good for the RPG genre. I mean, there's other studios like that, like Night Dive, who haven't really made a lot of original games, but at least they actually have taken some older sort of broken games and made them better. I think they did like Doom 64 and made a PC version. At least that's providing some sort of value, but I'm pretty sure most of the Beamdog games, the RPGs, they honestly worked fine on GOG before Beamdog stuffed around with them, and now you can only buy more expensive versions, these special editions, cost double the price, and what they provide is certainly not double the value. But this guy, Beamdog CEO, says there was a perception that 2D ISO games were a dead end from a technical investment standpoint. I was a huge critic of 2D games, mostly on the choppy nature of sprite-based animation versus the potential of 3D spherical linear interpolation. The render pipelines were also very heavy. Well, we saw the state of early 3D games, and most of them haven't aged very well. I mean, sometimes they have a nice classic style, they're nostalgic, those blocky polygons and everything, but high-quality 2D art, that is hard to beat. And the proof is in the pudding, because I'm not sure if you've noticed, but so many revivals of old 90s 2D games where they try and make a new one and it's 2D again, it looks way worse than the originals. The best example I can think of is Return to Monkey Island, the latest Monkey Island game. The art looks absolutely shocking compared to, say, Curse of Monkey Island, which still has aged well even though it came out in 1997. They're old point-and-click games, you can look them up, but 1997 Curse of Monkey Island looks incredible. So I don't know what this guy's really on about. Oh, 2D games are bad. It's probably just that they were expensive to make. They still looked absolutely fantastic. They've still aged really well across the board. But then Josh says, sure, though Temple of Elemental Evil addressed the sprite issue with a 2.5D approach that I thought worked quite well personally. And that makes sense because I had in my mind that Temple of Elemental Evil was 3D, but then I looked it up when I saw these tweets, and yeah, it is that sort of mix. Some of the characters I think look 3D, but I believe it still has 2D backgrounds. It looks really nice, and if you haven't played that game, it's really, really good. It's like a turn-based Dungeons & Dragons RPG. Excellent combat. It's been years since I've played it. I might actually revisit it, but it's one of the last genuine CRPGs from that early 2000s era. That is probably a must-play. I want to mention as well that David Gator got in on this as well, and the way I just said that when you read his surname makes it sound like something weird was going on. I didn't mean that, but it's interesting you list Temple of Elemental Evil, as at BioWare at least, that game's failure was really what caused the nail to be put in the proverbial coffin. As I recall, suddenly ISO and turn-based were both simply off the table. And that to me is really interesting because BioWare went from making some of the most in-depth games at the time in something like a Baldur's Gate 2 to basically dumbing things down until they were totally console-focused, and now they've totally lost the plot. Obviously, this happened after Baldur's Gate 2, and it would have been around the time they were probably making decisions around Knights of the Old Republic. I don't know a lot about that development history, but I would not be surprised if at some point they were considering an isometric Knights of the Old Republic game. I think a lot of people would be interested in something like that these days. I've heard a lot of talk. People say, oh, can't you give Star Wars or Knights of the Old Republic to Larian? Maybe they can handle the remake instead of the incompetent devs who are supposedly handling the KOTOR remake, if it's getting made at all. I think it might have even been cancelled. But basically, Knights of the Old Republic comes out. It's on Xbox. It's got that console focused. It is a good game, but if you really think about it, kind of plays like a My First RPG. It's kind of like the Super Mario RPG on the SNES to some extent, where it's just way simpler than most of the isometric RPGs that are out there. That might make some people mad because it's a nostalgic game, it's a fun game, it's just not super complex compared to some of the other ones. And I'm talking about the first game, the Obsidian one, the second KOTOR. It's probably got a more mature story, but it kind of plays the same way. It's just not super complex because it was designed for those consoles to work on a controller. And after that, we got Dragon Age and Mass Effect from BioWare. And both of those series, the first entries were when they felt most like RPGs, and then they just sort of fell away and they all turned into something else. Mass Effect was always actiony, but when you got to the second, third game, they were just action games with some RPG stuff kind of thrown in there. It was very obvious that BioWare just didn't care about the role-playing aspects as much. You did make choices, but very much the gameplay. It was just sort of Gears of War, shoot things, that was about it. They didn't care about the role-playing combat anymore. And Dragon Age, the less kind of said about it, the better, because Dragon Age Origins is pretty good, but after that, who cares about this series? Dragon Age 2, it was some sort of hack rush job because of EA. I think they wanted something out super quick. And Dragon Age Inquisition, wasn't it like the decayed remains of an MMO or something? It's why the game just feels so padded. MMO quests, super boring. It did not feel like Origins or any real classic RPG CRPG at all. I just don't really care about that series. And Dragon Age Dreadwolf, is there really any hype for it outside the remaining hardcore Bio fans, which there isn't really many of anymore? It's all very ironic to me because Baldur's Gate 3 is a huge success, and BioWare actually started this to some extent. They were making the original Baldur's Gates, they were selling pretty well, and then because of this sort of stuff, oh, Temple of Elemental Evil, another Dungeons and Dragons isometric game didn't sell, we're gonna have to completely change directions. And yet it's Baldur's Gate 3 that has sold 25 million copies, but BioWare, who were chasing trends, they've just had failure after failure. Anthem, Mass Effect Andromeda, pretty much anything else that they touch turns to crap. It's Larian who are reaping the rewards for just making a game that they want to make. It's basically impossible in the video game industry to try and predict trends because it takes so long to make these. They seem to take 4, 5, 6 years. By the time you get there, if you were doing it because of a trend from 5 years ago, people are going to have moved on. It happens with like Battle Royale, survival games, everything we see now. And to sum this all up, reading between the lines, these developers are basically saying that retail developers got together to kill the CRPG genre because they just did not see it as ever being a massive long-term moneymaker. Doesn't mean games were going to lose money, but they were basically saying, nah, if gaming continues like this, just a bunch of nerds playing these numbers, dice rolls, whatever, gaming's never going to get anywhere. Let's get these off our shelves. Let's just make up some excuse. That is what it kind of seems like, and the question is going to be, will this happen again? Because sure, we've got Steam, these digital storefronts, and the games are going to just be on there. There's nothing limiting store space, essentially, in the digital world. You just put your game on, someone can buy it if they want to. That's never going to be a problem. But the big publishers are still going to just try and be pushing the games that they want us to play. They want the mainstream to be all about microtransactions, live services, because it's popular. They will just ram it down our throats and do their best to brainwash, convince us to like it, because that's how they're going to make their money. They see it all the time with any of these, I guess you could call them boomer games, like Baldur's Gate 3. They know that this audience is going to push back on any sort of microtransaction, even a special edition with 1 or 2 goodies. People who play these are just not going to have it. So my prediction would be the bigger publishers like the EAs, the Ubisofts, anyone else who might make a Baldur's Gate 3 like in the next few years, you know there's probably going to be strings attached. And I mean, a studio like Ubisoft, as tedious and as incompetent as they often are, they did make the Mario and Rabbids games. They're okay tactical games. They're not massively in-depth, but it shows they can at least make something that resembles a real video game instead of the McDonald's equivalent when they want to. This is purely just a matter of game developers just wanting to make something that's totally around a conveyor belt. Gets you to spend money, gets you addicted. It cannot be about fun. That just can't be the case. That's pretty much what it comes down to. So we can only hope that history doesn't repeat, that the big conglomerates, maybe it's not retail companies these days, it's going to be game publishers in 2024. We just have to hope that they don't try and find a way to kill CRPGs once again. They're going to try, and it's going to be more propaganda, advertising, not necessarily towards us, but towards kids. What they really don't want is kids getting introduced to Baldur's Gate 3, young people, teenagers. Because if they actually see a real game and go, hang on, this is what gaming can be, it can actually be fun, I can just spend the base price and have an amazing time, that is a worse nightmare for the Activisions, the Microsoft, the EAs. Because when the illusion is broken, the curtain's peeled back, and people actually see, oh, I can actually just play a game that I enjoy, no strings attached, that's when people start to walk away from live service. It's happened to many of us. So that's how they're going to kill CRPGs once again. It's going to be about continuing to target the kids, get them into the live services, spending on microtransactions, no time for these uncool CRPGs. I hope it doesn't happen again. I hope more studios like Larian can keep doing the right thing. Indie devs can get more exposure. That is what I want. More fun games, more role-playing games. So thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.